Welcome to the Very Liberal Podcast with me, Lembit Öpik,
And me, Mark Oaten.
as we review the continuing and unfolding drama of the British general election, the one no one predicted for the 4th of July, apart from
Me, but it's not that dramatic. You call it a drama. It's been pretty dull so far, don't you think?
Oh, completely.
I think these elections only ever come to light when something goes wrong, because all the parties are stage managing it. They've got their launches. They've clearly tested every single word in focus groups.
You think so?
Oh yeah, clearly. The word change, for example, has clearly risen very highly on the opinion polls. Crazy.
How can that be a slogan? Change.
It says
No change.
But
little change.
I want something exciting. I want John Prescott. And do you remember the day when John Prescott, Deputy Prime Minister, he punched a voter? And do you remember when the Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, was in a car and he was misheard calling one of the voters a bigot? That's when elections come to life. That's when you see.
But not in a good way in the second time. With the first one, it was absolutely obvious that it massively helped Prescott.
I think it's about seeing the real politicians. And at the moment, I don't feel, as the election campaigns progress, we've really got to the bottom of where these personalities are, where they actually stand. We don't know them yet.
All right. In that case, let's look at the state of the parties, how they've done. Let's look at their policies and then the winners and losers, if you like, in terms of the individuals themselves. How do you think the parties are doing? Let's start with the Conservatives.
Do you know what? I think after a wet start with the umbrella,
literally,
it was a poor start. It took everybody by surprise. Do you know what? I think they'll be quite pleased. They've managed to get over some of the mishaps in the first few days. I think that they will be happy that they've got across policies which will reassure their core vote. What I don't understand yet is what their ambition is. Is it to actually try and sort of close the gap with Labour, or is it basically just to shore up their core vote? If it's the latter, then I think they will feel they've done okay in the first few days.
I'm not so sure. I think that their balmy policy statements, which we'll come to in a short while, just shows that they're not serious anymore. I actually think they're trying to drag the Labour Party into stupid discussions so that Labour have to respond, because they're going to have to carry this on. No one's pretending the Conservatives win this general election. So if one of them says something in the Tories, then Labour has to decide how to respond. I don't think they've had a good start.
Well, I'll give them 6 out of 10, which I think is good, because most of us thought they'd probably be on 2 or 3 out of 10.
Yeah,
so
like me.
That's the score I'm going to give them.
I'll give them 2.
Okay.
But Labour, much as I think they're going to be a terrible government, they've had a surprisingly good start and they don't deserve it. And their strategy seems to be what Boris Johnson did in 2019. Don't answer any questions. Don't talk yourself into a policy problem. Simply talk change. And they've got their 6 points and that's about it.
I mean, look, they're on message. The message isn't very long. The message is fairly bland, but at least they're sticking to it.
6 letters. Their message is 6 letters. Change.
Well, to be fair to them, they've got their pledge. They've said that. What's interesting, though, is that they're not really talking much more beyond the pledge. We're not getting much detail, but I think that's exactly what they want. So at this stage of the campaign, again, I'd give them maybe 7.
I'd give them 4.
Okay.
Better than the Tories. I should say, by the way, that's at the point where we're making the podcast. Maybe by some miracle, Keir Starmer comes out with a policy area that causes myself and Mark to join the Labour Party.
Or someone punches someone.
More likely.
More likely.
Yeah. Unless, of course, Tony Blair comes back and leads the Labour Party, in which case you'll be joining.
I'll be very, very happy.
Hoping for a peerage. What about reform now? They're the dark horse.
This is the tricky thing. None of us quite know what's going to happen. At the moment, they've been polling around 10-12% of the opinion polls, which is a very, very high polling for a party that actually before this election nobody had really heard of. The difficulty for them will have been, first of all, the scramble to get candidates, which they will probably have done in around 500 to 600 seats maybe. They, however, are lacking the big beast. There isn't a key person who is recognisable leading that party. Everybody thought it would have been. Everybody thought it would, but he's not. He's bottled it. He's decided to earn his money. He wants to earn money on GB News, so he's decided not to actually lead that party. And I think their problem is going to be, without a focus, without a clear leader, they're going to struggle to get the air.
Richard Tice has done better than I expected. Don't you think so?
Where do you think they're going to take the votes from?
Well, it's Conservatives. 90% of it's coming from the Conservatives.
I think so.
think maybe 10% from the others.
I think there could be an opportunity for them to be the protest party. It could be that some of those Labour voters who are dissatisfied, want to get rid of the Conservatives, actually think that reform could be the way to do that. And that's a big risk, I might add, for the Lib Dems.
I don't think anyone thinks reform's going to win more than a handful of seats, and quite possibly none at all. I think that Farage, actually, he's been honest. He said that he doesn't think that he would win in a 6-week campaign.
But if you are fed up with politics, and a lot of people are, if you look at the undecided figure in all of the private polling, there's a lot of people who don't know what to do. And if reform had somebody like Farage leading them during the campaign, I can see that they would be a plague on all your houses. We're voting reform. Which is why a lot of people voted, incidentally, for Brexit. It wasn't necessarily about the arguments for or against Europe. It was to show the establishment a fingers up to the establishment. And that's why reform could get quite a few votes in this election.
There was a by-election in Blackpool before the general election, and basically it was second equal between reform and the Conservatives. 100 votes in it, I think. They were so frustrated. I've talked to reform people. If only they'd done a little bit more. But the fact is, I think they are protest vote. The Conservatives who hate the Conservatives will now vote reform, expecting the Tories to lose anyway, because that's what they're being told. And they have a good even spread of votes. But as you and I both know, that's no good. You have to be able to concentrate it into a particular constituency. So while the Lib Dems, we can talk about them in a minute, will do well, reform will probably flatline.
I think they could end up with maybe 12% and no seats.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the Lib Dems could end up with 12% and maybe 60, 70 seats.
Not that many.
Well, okay, let's talk about them. I think they've had a good start to the campaign.
What, Ed Davey falling into the water?
He made a splash, and that's a good thing in this. And that's a good thing in
that sinking feeling.
It's a good thing in this campaign. Look, I think they've had a good start to the campaign. It's critical for them, however, just as much as the national news are covering them. It's critical that they're doing the work in those target seats. The party has, as we know from our time, what they call the air war and the ground war. So I think the air war has been okay with the national media.
Bit lightweight.
But it's the ground war that will really matter. What is happening in 80 to 90 seats down on the ground? Are they getting those flying start leaflets out? Are they knocking on enough doors? Are they making sure that their candidates are doing the right thing, being seen at the right events? And critically, are they getting the message across to Labour voters that in those seats, it's a tactical vote? You need to vote for the Lib Dems to get rid of the Tories. And that's the battleground that matters for the party, not necessarily Ed jumping off into the middle of a lake in the middle of nowhere. It's what happens in those individual target seats.
I watched it was actually a local election in Dorking or that area.
You get very nerdy in your old age watching local.
What do you mean in my old age?
Well,
I was doing this when I was 15.
Yeah,
you were the Johnny come lately.
Once a nerd, always a nerd, Lembit.
Okay,
Come on.
fine.
Anyway.
Taxi. Anyway,
Uber.
I was. I hope we're getting sponsorship for that. No reasonable offer refused.
Absolutely,
by the way.
Right.
I prefer black cabs, but that's a distraction. I went to see this election taking place. Lib Dems were in third place in this ward. It's something I think somebody Hall said, "Law, have the name wrong there," and they won. They won by 400 votes, quite a convincing majority. They did what you said, which tells me that all the techniques that got us into Parliament can still work. I don't think they'll get 70 seats, but I think they'll get 44 to 49, something like that.
Okay, make a deal.
Yeah, how much? What's the bet?
The bet is I'll have another tattoo. I will.
No, forget it.
You're not going to have a tattoo. You're not doing.
I'm not going to do that. No, money.
Money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obsessed with money. Look. Let's just have a gentleman. I'll buy you dinner at the Ivy.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Okay.
you heard it first. This is the bourgeois Liberal Democrats, by the way. Watch and learn.
It's the Ivy Cafe. I reckon we'll win. I'm going 70 or above.
I say 44. Whoever's closer.
Okay.
Face. You saw it first here at the Very Liberal podcast. It does leave one other party we have to talk about, and that's the SNP. Now, you'll recall that the Scottish National Party have been reigning supreme in Scotland for a very long time. And I have to say that Alex Salmond was a tremendous leader. He just literally just wiped the floor. They've crashed and burned now. I think they're going to have a very, very bad election.
And of course, that will mean that Labour get an extra 15, 20 seats, which
Maybe more,
which will help them towards a
So you
bigger
agree?
majority. I agree. I think it is going that direction. I think that Plaid are also going to suffer. And I think the big winners in both Wales and Scotland from the Nationalist Party's decline will be the Labour Party. Now, if this had been a close election, then that could have been critical. As it turns out, I think it will just add numbers to the Labour majority.
Let's do a racing look at the policy development. Once again, this is from our standpoint now, and things will develop quickly. My judgment is that the Conservatives are just guessing. National service, and then, oh, it's not compulsory. And Cleverly, who's one of the ministers in the Conservative Party, said, oh, well, maybe the 18-year-olds could be special constables. What? So the special constable 18-year-old goes to get their mates who are in the army on the same scheme to go home.
I mean,
it's not going to work.
It looked like somebody in Tory Central Office or in Rishi's inner circle thought, right, what do we need to say to attract reform voters? What are we going to do to stop reform from growing? I've got a great idea. We'll talk about national service. Now, actually, the practicalities of this are unbelievable, because the idea that the military would be in a position to take hundreds and hundreds of 18-year-olds when they've got so much to do themselves. I mean, the military don't want this. I don't think the Prime Minister's been able to quote a single military leader that said it's a good idea. I do, however, and you won't like this, but I do have some sympathy with the idea of young people being involved in their community.
So do I. I agree.
Some form of community service, I think, could be a good thing.
But it has to be I totally agree with you. This is not it.
No.
This ridiculous thrashing about where you spend a year in the military or 25 days doing community service and everything's going to be fine.
Would you have done it? You got flat feet or something? You'd have probably got out of it, wouldn't you?
Conscientious objector.
Okay.
I'd worn the whatever thing that you're meant to wear. No, I did.
It's the young dad's army.
I was
I mean, you know,
kids army.
Kids army.
Kids army.
They do like it up them. But that's a cultural reference. That's a cultural reference.
You're qualified to comment. Moving swiftly on. I was actually in the CCF Combined Cadet Force for 2 weeks.
Were you? You got thrown out.
No, I left. I deserted.
You did?
They wanted me to get my hair cut. I used to have long hair. I didn't want to do it after that. And I used to avoid Maxwell. That was the sixth former who was in charge at my school. And then he caught me in a corridor and said, "You're not really cut out for the army, are you?" I went, no, sir. And that was the end of it. You know,
the end of his military career. Thank God for that.
But
Labour, of course, also talking about young people. Instead of national service for them, they want to give 16-year-olds the vote. What do you think of that?
Well, as the former youth affairs spokesperson for the Lib Dems, I agreed with it. Now I'm not so sure.
Older and wiser.
After Jo Swenson's amazing performance as leader of the party.
She wasn't 16.
No, but she was young. She was older than that. And she just basically messed it up. I was the only person on TV predicting she'd lose her seat.
That's got absolutely nothing to do with giving vote. Surely the argument is if you pay tax, if you're allowed to get married, if you're allowed to serve in the military, then you should have a say in the government. I
actually wrote that script.
Did you?
I wrote that script, yeah. That's what we used to say. Technically, I have to say, and morally, they should have the vote. But
I don't. But I think it's Starmer has said something which I'm sure he thinks will help attract votes.
Yeah, but they can't vote. Yeah, that's the point. The irony is, even if it's a good idea, you don't get any votes from 16 or 17-year-olds.
And probably lose a few votes at the other age spectrum. In fact, when I've been campaigning out near Bristol, and an elderly lady came out when I was shoving a leaflet through her doorstep and said, "I don't believe in giving children the vote." And that age group probably feel that 16 is very, very young.
After the election, let's have a debate about the age of voting. Before the election, it's a ridiculous policy because no one's going to vote for the Labour Party on that basis.
And what about the Lib Dems policy? Their big announcement, quite rightly in my view, was to focus on the NHS. It is, for me, unquestionably the biggest political issue of the day. And they had a policy which was to recruit 8,000 more GPs. We all know how hard it is to see a GP. The problem with the policy is, can you actually create 8,000 jobs? It takes a long time to train a GP. They were saying they were going to try and persuade some GPs to stay a little bit longer. That would be around 4,000 and then recruit another 4,000. But I think they're spot on with this issue because people do want to see a GP. And at the moment, you have this crazy 8 o'clock phone call in the morning when you're held in a queue. I think it's a big issue. I think the Lib Dems are right to raise it.
Health and economy are always massive issues, and sometimes international foreign policy too. I agree, but so far I've seen Ed Davey talking about water, and water's a huge player in southwest of England, roughly where you are, but it's not going to win you an election. And the other problem, and this is back to presentation, he's done lots of stunts. Now, we're no strangers to stunts ourselves, and I lost and you left, but neither of us expected or pretended we could be prime minister. My worry is that even his good policy announcements are being slightly obscured by the razzmatazz.
Look, I think he's got a difficult act to play here. He needs, on the one hand, to capture media attention. He needs somehow to have gimmicks which are all around the blue wall and how you can have this hammer to knock down the blue wall of these Conservative seats. But at the same time, he's got to come up with credible policies which people will like. I think he's on a winner of the NHS. And I think that if he can cost this and he can move on to talk about the problems with A&E waiting times, problems with ambulances, response times, talk about the problems with trying to see an NHS dentist. There is a rich vein of policy around the NHS, which I think will help the Lib Dems.
Oh, up to a point, but there still is this uni-party feel on the big issues like Ukraine and Gaza, and actually basically economics.
No one's talking about that.
Yeah, but Labour, Lib Dems, and Conservatives all sound the same on the big issues. Remember that you and I have previously both agreed that the Greens did well because they said they supported a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, that means that there is certainly a constituency of support that Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, recognises that the Labour Party's lost. They could simply say, we are in favour of a ceasefire, and then it could become a big policy opportunity.
This may yet crop up during the election campaign where, you know, we're still got a long way to go. These issues could still pop along. But if we look at where we are at the moment and we look at the opinion polls and we see what's happened, there's not been much change. They haven't shifted much. I sense maybe a slight firming up of the Conservative vote, maybe a slight narrowing of the gap. But at this stage, I would imagine we're still heading for a fairly large Labour majority.
We have to talk about Scotland and Wales a bit. Wales is in a big mess. There's a motion of no confidence, which is politically motivated against the Labour leader. I haven't got time to talk about the details there, but they're in trouble. And the SNP are imploding. They're falling apart after decades of success there since the devolution settlement was pretty much set up. They don't seem to be able to pull themselves together. And you've mentioned this before. That's where Labour's going to get maybe 24 seats up to that, something like that.
Well, look, we've made our predictions on how many seats the Lib Dems will get. I think next podcast we need to start talking about predictions on majorities and what we think. But for the moment, I think it's all to play for the Lib Dems. The Conservatives have got to try and shore up that vote, and Labour have got to start, in my judgment, to show a bit of personality. Otherwise, they will just end up being so bland that actually the strategy of doing and saying nothing could backfire.
Maybe Starmer will be the next prime minister. It's just about his majority. But let's talk about the individuals. Who's done well over the last few days?
If you say doing nothing is a measure of achievement, then for me it's Starmer, because that was the strategy, to do and say very little, to make sure there's no cock-ups, bluntly. So
but they had the debacle with Diane Abbott, which it's still causing scars in the party.
That plays well with the argument that says, look, we've got rid of the left, we've got rid of the crazy gang. So, you know, all round for me, I would say Starmer's had the best start to the election campaign. I don't believe it. I think that he needs to up his game. But as a strategy of starting cautiously and safe, that's worked. He now needs to start coming alive and show some personality.
I think that Farage is the big winner, actually. He's not even standing for a seat, and he's wagging the dog. He's on television all the time. He was completely disrespected by the BBC, which had to issue an apology because they were quite judgmental about him. I think that he's a bit of a kingmaker here.
it's always, I mean, if you look back over the last almost decade, you do feel that although he's never been elected to Parliament, Farage has had such a huge influence on British politics, whether it's forcing Cameron into that disastrous referendum, whether it's shifting the Conservative Party more to the right. It is quite extraordinary. Whether you like him or not, he's also a character. And I think one of the things that we're learning from this election is that the current party leaders are, there's no big characters
What
out
we're
there.
lacking in this election is big characters. Farage isn't going to be an MP, obviously. His party's not going to be the government next time. But still, he just influences everything like a great gravity source around which lots of the right especially are orbiting. Do you think there has been a big loser so far?
So far, not. And I think that, as I said right at the start of this podcast, it's events, it's the unexpected, it's things which you learn about individual candidates and leaders that we don't know will bring this election to life. Nobody's lost at the moment, but nobody's taken a huge leap forward either.
The country has lost because two people aren't standing. Us.
I think the absolute blessing that we're not Lembit, because it means we can be here and we can be here next time round.
And we will be. I'm Lembit.
And I'm Mark Oaten.
Thanks for watching.